The idea behind my project was to create a 2-player competitive version of Conway's Game of Life. First, I'll explain the original concept of Conway's Game of Life, then continue with how my own implementation builds on it. John Conway's game was first made famous due to a publication in Scientific American in 1970 that outlined the basic rules of Conway's game. The world is a 2-dimensional grid of cells that can either be dead or alive. The universe operates in discrete time steps where the previous state of the board determines the next state. You may be asking yourself, what laws govern the next world state? Well, there are 3 rules I'll go over now. When covering the rules, I'll mention a cell's neighbours a lot. All I mean by this is the cells which are located in the cardinal and ordinal directions to the cell in question. The first rule is that any living cell with 2 or 3 neighbours will happily survive into the next generation. The second rule determines how new cells are born into the world. If a dead cell has exactly 3 living neighbours, then it will spring to life in the next generation. The third and final rule is that any living cell that has less than 2 or more than 3 neighbours dies, as if by loneliness or overpopulation respectively. The original publication's title actually called it a solitaire game, which can be fun, sure, but the motivation behind my project was to turn Conway's original creation into something more palatable for our generation of dopamine seekers and competitive gamers. Therefore, I tried to stay true to the original game mechanics while also adding some unique features such as bringing it into the 3rd dimension, color coordinated teams, and adding visual and sound effects. However, in order to make the game competitive, I had to introduce a 4th rule. Any new cell being brought to life by its 3 parents will take the color of the majority of its parents. As you can see on screen, 2 of the 3 parents are red, so the new cell is also red in the next time step. So now we know how the rules work. How do we plan our setup, and how do we win? Well, each player takes turns placing cells on their side of the board. This continues until both players are happy with their setups. There's no maximum number of cells you can place, but remember rule 3, cells can die by either overcrowding or loneliness, so placing your cells requires tactic and strategy. Once both players are happy with their cell placements, they can hit the play button and the simulation will start churning out the new board states based on the 4 rules covered earlier. The number of time steps to be calculated can be adjusted in the settings tab, and the winner is defined by whoever has the most surviving cells when that number of time steps has been completed. Since we've now covered the basics of the gameplay, I'm now going to go over some of the more complex and interesting features in the game. I decided to use a 3D environment to add flair to the visuals, which meant that I couldn't just use the mouse coordinates to determine what the player wanted to select. So I've had to raycast from the player's vision onto the environment and read that data. I've also implemented an AI so that you can either play with a friend on the same computer or play against the AI. It's one of the most complex parts of the project, and it works by looking at the current board state and checking every possible place that it could place a cell. It then simulates the game out X number of times and records the outcome, X being defined by the AI difficulty which is set in the settings. Once it's checked every possible location, it will evaluate which one gives it the most successful outcome. The Pattern Explorer also took careful planning and time to implement. When you click the Patterns button in the bottom left, you will be met with this screen. A list of patterns names will appear on the left. The ones that are greyed out are too big to fit on your currently selected board size. A preview area is also shown along with a short description of the pattern. You can then hit the place button and put it where you see fit. If the AI is enabled at this point, it will get as many turns to place cells as there are cells alive in the pattern that you chose. There's also a settings page where the player can tweak various settings such as whether or not to enable the AI or play with a friend. They can change the AI's difficulty. They can modify the time between simulation cycles to make the simulation faster or slower. They can edit the number of simulations that happen before a winner is determined, or they can change the board size to allow for larger patterns to be placed, and they can also toggle whether or not to exist in an infinite universe. All I mean by an infinite universe is that the rules will apply to the edges of the board as if they were wrapped in on themselves. For example, a cell at the bottom of the board would think its neighbours below it existed despite being on the opposite side of the map. Think of a globe shape. A fair amount of time was also put into the general experience of the game. For example, when a cell dies, they explode and fly away making a popping noise. The colour scheme follows a red versus blue theme. The font used is geometric and stays constant through the game screens to give it a consistent feel. and there's also subtle colour changes when the mouse hovers over objects and buttons to help easily indicate what's about to be selected. Unfortunately, there are some things that I didn't get to implement that I would have liked to. In my detailed proposal, I said I would have liked to make the game online, so you could play with friends without having to be in the same room as them. However, I underestimated the difficulty of implementing this and decided not to include this feature. I also considered training a neural network to be the AI in the game, as I thought it would be interesting to see what kind of tactics it would come up with. However, this would have taken longer than anticipated to reach fruition, although I think it would have been a cool and unique feature given enough time. Finally, I mentioned including music in my proposal. This could easily be added, and I did try it. However, I don't think it's a vital feature of gameplay, considering most people often prefer to listen to their own music, and it would probably get annoying for the player, considering it definitely annoyed me throughout the development process. Finally, my conclusions. After having various members of my family test the software, it became quickly obvious that it's not an easy or intuitive game to understand right off the bat. All of the participants struggled to create effective pattern design and found it difficult to be even the easiest AI. There's probably only a small number of people that would be able to play this game well and enjoy it. Despite the game not achieving the reception I had anticipated, I believe I created the game that I set to realise to the best of my ability within the given time. The AI is unbeatable and the mechanics run smooth as a slide into hell if you're covered in butter.